Welcome back to the Explanation Pro. Today I'll recap a biographical war film called Max Manus, Man of War. Spoilers incoming. The movie starts in Sala, Finland as Norwegian soldiers are in combat against the Soviets. One of the soldiers and the protagonist, Max, wakes up in the hospital. A nurse nearby constantly reassures him that he's in the hospital while he silently looks around. Months after the battle in Sala, Max and his friend, Kolbein, meets up with other young men, Gunnar, Talek, and Gregers. The group hopes that they can fight against the German invasion of Norway. They eventually decide to start their resistance by printing newspapers to reverse the propaganda by the Germans. While putting up posters in public, mysterious men watch them from a car. Gunnar begins to think that Max is careless for wanting to blow up a building in an attempt to take down the enemy, as he knows that civilians will be punished instead. Meanwhile, Gregers is packing to leave and to join a more organized resistance outside the country. Later on, Max and his friends join forces with Jens Christian, who was Max's childhood friend and the man who saw them posting flyers earlier. He tells them that they would be following the orders from the English government and that their network in the country is composed of mostly amateurs and would need training. Max and Kolbein tell him that they don't need any training, but Jens Christian tells them that their tasks now aren't like fighting in the trenches, which is where the former two are experienced in. He also says that they would need to be more careful because even having one of them be caught would expose their entire group. Max comes home to his apartment and finds it filled with German officers. He tells them that he needs to use the bathroom and they hit him on the back of his head before dragging him there. Some of the officers guard him while the others search his apartment and find some explosives. They start to arrest him and threaten him with the death penalty before he jumps out the window. The scene in the hospital from earlier plays again and the nurse is still talking to him. He grabs her arm and asks her how many guards were outside. She answers that there are 5 and that they are armed. He starts to ask her for her name and if she's willing to go against the Germans before asking her to deliver a message. Later that night, Max overhears the doctor telling the German officers that they cannot immediately arrest him and move him out of the hospital or he will die. Meanwhile, Jens Christian and Gunnar plan to break him out of the hospital. The nurse places a tray of food and a towel. He waits for the nurse to leave the room before he unfolds the towel. He finds a piece of paper and a pair of pliers before he reads the message that Kolbein has been caught and that his other companions will be waiting for him outside the hospital later that night. Max then eats the paper to avoid being caught. That night, he uses the pliers to free himself from being bound to the bed. A German officer then enters the room, so Max quickly hides the pliers and pretends to be unconscious. The officer lights up a cigarette and starts to smoke before Max pretends to cough violently. The nurse enters the room and asks the German officer to smoke outside the room. Once the officer leaves, Max tells the nurse that he can handle this on his own and that she should leave. She helps her escape instead. Once he's free, the nurse asks him to hit her so it wouldn't seem like she was part of the plan. He kisses her before he hits her with the pliers and escapes. The next morning, a German officer named Femmer interrogates the nurse, who now has bruises on her face. He seems sympathetic to her but secretly figures out that she and the doctor were accomplices and orders for their arrest. He also orders for Max's picture to be sent out to all posts. Max soon arrives at a training camp in Scotland. He enters the office of Captain Ling, who recognizes him as the window jumper. Max asks if there's anything he can finally do and if he can join raids, saying that the captain has led successful raids before. Ling then points out that because of those raids, the Germans killed many of his men and burned down a town. He then tells Max to report to Gregers, who is now a corporal. He finds Gregers teaching a class about propaganda. The two of them take a walk and discuss Kolbein, who has apparently willingly stayed in prison and helped other prisoners escape. Soon, the two of them join training together. Max eventually gets assigned to a mission, but he's frustrated that Gregers isn't included in it. He goes to Colonel Wilson to ask him about it, as Captain Ling is nowhere to be found. Wilson tells him that since they're planning on expanding the school, then they want Gregers to stay and help them. He also tells Max that Ling had just died. The two of them then drink before continuing the conversation. Wilson thinks that Gregers lacks experience in the field, so Max promises to look after him. The colonel eventually agrees. The next morning, Wilson gives them a briefing before they're sent back to Norway. While Max briefs some of the men assigned under him, one of them asks if civilians were going to be hurt because of what they're going to do. Max assures him that they won't because they'll be wearing English uniforms. That night, Max and his men go to the Oslo harbor and attach plastic explosives under the German ships. The lights suddenly turn on as the night shift starts, which makes it harder to escape. The next morning, Talik and one other member of their group watch as the explosives detonate and they cheer. Femmer finds the letter that Max left behind. He gets told that a higher-ranking officer expects him to find who was behind it. He then says that he already arrested 5 dock workers, as he thinks that even if the English were responsible for the bombings, they still would have had help from the locals. He then stands up and approaches a new employee in their office named Solveig. He then flirts with her. Max and Gregers hike through the woods to get to Sweden. Max asks Gregers where they'll be staying and he tells Max that a woman named Tikken would take care of that and that she was going to be their boss. They arrive at the British consulate in Stockholm and Gregers starts to find Tikken. Max approaches an employee and hands her a list of equipment that they would need. The employee tells him to line up like everyone else before entering an office, where Gregers is waiting. The two of them share a hug before Gregers introduces her to Max as Tikken. The three of them then eat dinner in a restaurant. Gregers excuses himself to go to the bathroom, leaving Max and Tikken behind. The two of them start to become passive-aggressive towards one another and as Gregers comes back, Tikken stands up to leave. Max and Gregers return to Scotland, where they are awarded by the King of Norway for succeeding in their mission. Meanwhile, Femmer meets with the mother of one of the men he arrested. She tells him that his son isn't involved with the bombings and that they are loyal to the Germans. Femmer assures her that he'll do what he can, which impresses Solveig. However, Femmer doesn't stop the execution of the 5 workers he arrested. Max hears about the execution and gets frustrated. Solveig hears of Femmer's inaction and confronts him about it. Kolbein eventually gets released from prison and he reunites with Max. The two of them drink coffee while Kolbein expresses his want to continue joining the resistance against the Germans. Max and Gregers meet up with Gunnar, who tells them that Norway's Prime Minister has started a mandatory work program for young boys and that they have the list of those who will be forced to join in 2 buildings, a police major's house and the employment office. They bomb the employment office to get rid of the archives. However, Max decides to burn the files in the police major's house so as not to hurt the civilians in the apartment building. This takes a lot of time and most members of their group get killed and captured, while Max gets shot in the neck. Max survives and regrets not blowing up the archives as planned. He reads the newspaper where his companions are called terrorists. Gregers then shows him his own newspaper and tells him that there are 2 sides to every story. The two of them then return to Stockholm and dine again with Tikken. They give her a framed picture of the two of them as a gift. She makes mention of a 5-year-old son who's away in boarding school, which makes Max frown. Gregers soon falls asleep and Max and Tikken start to be more friendly with one another. The two of them go to where Max is staying and Max opens up more about his childhood. They start to drink more and eventually dance. They almost kiss but Tikken backs away and says that she has to go before leaving. Max goes back to their small headquarters in Norway, where Gunnar shows him a newspaper with his picture on it. He and the others are dismissive about it and laugh it off while Gunnar is serious and warns them to be more careful. Gunnar leaves before Max accidentally shoots himself on the leg and the chest. They call for a doctor to come and check on him as they can't send him to a hospital. The doctor tells them that he would need to go to the hospital to get all of the bullet pieces out and suggests he go to Sweden to do so. Max asks Gregers to come with him but he declines, saying that one of them would need to watch over the others. During the train ride, he has another nightmare about his time in Finland. Meanwhile, Talik and Gregers go to a cafe where they meet up with an informant. Gregers starts to notice suspicious men inside the cafe and realizes that they have been tricked. He shoots the men before more of the German police arrive. The Germans shoot Gregers on the neck fatally and he falls out the window, lying down on the street until he dies. They then capture Talik, who is injured but alive to be interrogated. Tikken tells Max about what happened and he regrets leaving them. He takes his things and starts to leave, despite Tikken's protests. Talik eventually hangs himself while being held captive by the Germans. Max talks to a German during the train ride home. The German greets him because it's Christmas Eve and gives him a bottle of wine, while Max gives him a box of cigarettes. Max then cynically vents out to the German about how he plans to take down a huge German ship called the Donau and about the death of his friends. The train stops and he stands up to leave. Max returns to their headquarters while the Germans have a fancy Christmas feast. He then starts to prepare to take on the Donau by himself, as he's tired of having his friends dying. Kolbeinn angrily tells them that they'll do it together and survive. They pose as electricians and successfully plant the plastic explosives, all with the names of their fallen friends, on the Donau. As they start to leave, Kolbeinn bumps into Femur, though they don't get exposed. Max separates from them and returns to Stockholm. The Donau explodes and Femur gets told that the railway lines have been destroyed too. He then orders a list of the addresses of any one part of the resistance so that they can finally confront them. In Stockholm, Max sees Tikken leave with her family. He tries to ask her to stay behind but she declines. The Germans start raiding the hideouts of the resistance and Gunnar urges Max to go back to Sweden, but he refuses to leave without his friends. He grabs a gun and goes to one of the hideouts to face against the Germans. He sees some of his companions dead and sits in horror, unable to fight back. The war eventually ends as news of Hitler's death play on the radio. Max walks through the streets where the people are celebrating. He eventually visits Femur in prison. The two of them talk about the war and share a smoke. Max shakes his hand before he leaves. Max arrives at one of their hideouts just as Kolbeinn was leaving and enters the living room. He looks at the flag before sitting down on the couch. He then imagines that all of his other companions are still alive and are gathered around him for a drink as they laugh and joke around. Then, Greg offers a toast to him, and the rest drink. He looks around again and the room is empty once again. He pours himself a drink. Tikken later finds him there sleeping on the couch, drunk. He opens up about his grief, especially about Gregor's death and the end of the war. They argue before Max starts to cry and Tikken comforts him. They finally share a kiss and Tikken convinces him to step out of the room. The movie ends as Max joins a victory parade in the same car as the king. He looks around frantically before eventually calming down and smiling. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and also subscribe to my channel for more videos like this. See you in the next video.